In this video we're going to extend the prototype we built in the first video, and we're going to map in the data from the business source systems and build the ETL process. So let's recap the people we've met so far. So initially we met Sarah. Sarah's our sales manager. She's the decision maker in the business, and it's Sarah that's got the requirements that we're going to build the data warehouse around. And we met Bill, who's our business analyst, our non-technical user, who's going to create the prototype. And he's built the prototype for us in the first video, and we're going to now build on that prototype. So what have we done so far? Sarah defined the user story for us and gave that information to Bill. She also gave us some sample data that we could use to test and make sure that the data warehouse was going to serve the business requirement. Sarah defined some acceptance criteria, and Bill then created the structure for our data warehouse and our cube. And Bill then delivered the prototype using Excel to Sarah, and Sarah signed off the model as being an accurate representation of the data that she needs to get out of the system. And really what we see in there then is our agile approach. So initially we obtained our user story, and then we built the model. The model was signed off as being accurate, and we're now going to move into the ETL phase and create the extract, transform and load procedures that are going to fill the data warehouse with data. So we need some new people in order to do this, so we're introducing now a new role, and that role is the database administrator or developer. In our case that's Oliver. Oliver is the SQL Server database administrator for our business. He's responsible for reporting across the company and wants to be able to write reusable reporting solutions that don't require complex code, so they're easy to manage and easy to maintain. So what's Oliver going to do? Oliver's going to discuss with Sarah where the data is currently stored within the business, and then he's going to look to the time extender tool and decide which data source providers he wants to use to extract that data from the source systems. And there are many available, and there's an example of some of them. So Sarah's then going to tell Oliver where the data is within the system. So in this case, Sarah's going to say that our measures information, our quantitative data, is all stored within Dynamics AX. And also, for this particular user story, the master data for customers, items and salespeople are also defined within the AX ERP solution. So let's go back to Time Extender and looking at building the ETL process. Okay, so here's our Time Extender project, and you remember from video 1 that we have our dimensions defined here in our prototype and our fact table, which contains our measures information. You'll also remember that these tables include some sample data that we used for signing off on our prototype. We're going to leave that in there for the time being, and we're going to move on to look at building the ETL. So down in the bottom of the model here, we're going to connect to a data source, and we're going to use one of Time Extender's adapter data sources. These are fundamentally just SQL Server connectors with some added intelligence so they understand the structure. So we're going to say we're going to connect this to an AX 2012 database. So we're going to say this is on a SQL Server database, and it's on my local SQL Server, and I'm going to select the AX 2012 demo database, which is just a Contoso demo database from Microsoft. So once we've created that data source in there, we need to do a couple of things. So we need to set up our company accounts. So Time Extender queries the tables in AX, and because it understands the structure, it knows which companies we've got in there. So these are the list of all the companies in our AX database. We're just going to select the CEU company for now. We could select multiple companies in there, and Time Extender will handle the multi-company element. So we're going to say OK to that. We're then going to ask Time Extender to read the objects from the SQL database. Okay, so you recognise on the right here, now we've got a list of all the tables and views within our AX system. We've also got a few extra tables that have been created for us within the AX database that hold things like enum mappings and bits of information that we can use to make life easier for us when we come to map ETL for Dynamics AX. So we're going to go ahead now and then start mapping some of the tables into our ETL solution. So the first dimension we need to map is our customers dimension, and you remember the fields that we have in our customer dimension, the customer number and customer name. So in AX 2012, the majority of that information is going to come from our cust table. So if we go to the customer table in the fields list, we see here, if we expand that, a list of all the fields that are available to us. We can preview the data in the source system, so we can see a real live view into our AX database. So we need to select the account number field, and then we need to get the customer name. Now in AX 2012 the customer name information is stored in the DIR party table, so we just need a reference out to that table. So in AX 2012 that's the party field, and you'll see that's now reflected here in our data source. So we've got those three fields. So we then need to add the DIR party table so that we can look up the customer's name. So we just filter this list then and find the DIR party table. And once we get to the DIR party table, we just need to add in the name, which is going to be the customer name, and then we also need to put in the record ID, which is this reference to this key over here in the customer table called party. So once we've got those in there, we just need to tell Time Extender what order to execute these. So let's just move that one up there. And then we need to map a relationship between our DIR party table and the customer table. So the relationship is the rec ID, and we map in that to the party. So if we do that, Time Extender knows that we want to create a relation. So if we say yes to that, that will create the relation for us. We can then simply drag the name here, and because Time Extender understands the relationship, we can just drop it on the customer table, use the relationship as a join, and we now have the customer name on the customer table. So we can execute these fields. I'll execute the customer table. And then if we preview the data in the customer table, we should now see that data from our CEU company is pulled in with the name as well that's been dragged across from the party table. The second dimension we need to map is the items dimension, and again we're just looking to pick up the item number and the item name. So if we go back to our data source again, we need to use the invent table for this, and there's a table and a view in here called invent table expanded. So if we look at the fields that are available in invent table expanded, then we need to select our item ID, and then we've got a product name field as well in there. And that really is all we need to do for the items. So if we execute that, we will now get in Time Extender a list of all our items and item IDs that we can map into the ETL. So we're good with that one. And the next dimension we need to map is the salespersons dimension. So if we go back to our data source again, in AX 2012, our salespeople are stored in person name table, so it's called DIR person name. So if we found that table down here and we expand that, we can then pick up the attributes we want about the person and their name. So we need the person ID, and then we need the name. Now AX stores the name as first name and last name, so we'll join those together in a moment, but if we select those fields for now, and we see then that appears in our staging table, and then in order to get that that joined name, that first name plus second name, we can add a custom field to our Time Extender project, and we'll call this salesperson name, and we'll just increase the size there in case somebody's got a long name, so we'll put 100 characters of space in there. And then if we add a field transformation to this, we can add a custom field transformation, and that then allows us in Time Extender to select our first name, and using standard SQL functions we can add a space in there, and then add in also our last name, and OK that. And then if we deploy and execute our salespersons table, we should now get our salespeople, their first name and last name, and also our new custom field for salesperson full name within our sales table there. And finally, we need to create the extraction from the source system for our sales transaction tables that stores all our measure information. So again, if we go back to our data source, the view we're going to use for this is cost invoice trans expanded, which is this one here, and we're going to select a few fields from here. So we're going to need our cost field, which is called COGS, which is that one. We're going to need the item ID to map into our item dimension. We're going to need our invoice ID, We're going to need our invoice account to match the customer. We're going to need our line amount in local currency, and we're going to need our quantity field. And the last field we need to add to the invoice transactions table is the reference to our salespeople. Now in AX 2012 the salesperson is actually stored against our customer, so we need to map that through onto the transaction table so that we've got a reference for our BI solution. So we're going to go and add the reference on the customer table on the extract, and the field is called main contact worker. So we're going to add that person, that reference into our customer table. You've noticed that appears on our staging table up here now. So we can then drag our main contact worker from our customer table into our transaction table, and we get a lookup field, and it's going to look up on the contact worker, and then we can add a join in there to join the fields together, and we're going to join our account number field down to our invoice account field, which will do that mapping for us, and OK that. We should have our join down here now, so that will now stamp our main contact worker on each record in our transactional table. We probably just want to rename that to make it a bit clearer what it is, so we're going to call that salesperson ID so that we can remember when we come to do the data warehouse mapping that that's what that field is. We can now deploy and execute our customer table to get that new field populated within it, and we can then deploy and execute our transaction table. Okay, so we now have our extract from our Dynamics AX system complete. We've got our staging tables, and they contain all the fields we think we're going to need for the data warehouse. So we can now go and map those up to our data warehouse. So if we just make us a bit more space. So if we start with the customer dimension, we need to map our customer number, which is called account number, and drop that there. And we're just going to do a data movement, and then our customer name onto the customer name field. It's the customer table complete, and we do the same for items. So if we look in our event table, extract and get our item number and our item name, OK that. We can do the same for our salesperson. So we have here, we have our salesperson ID, and we have our salesperson's full name, which we did as a custom field. And then we map our sales transactions. So if we get them from our custom invoice trans expanded, we can take our customer number, which is invoice account, our item number, which is item ID, our salesperson ID, which was that field we mapped, and then our quantitative values, so quantity sold, our line amount, our cost amount, and our margin field already has our custom calculation in from the prototype. So we can now deploy and execute these items. So if we look at the data that's now in our tables, if we look at our dimension tables, they're all good. They've got data from AX, but if we have a look at our transaction table, we see that we've only got our custom data that we use to test our model, and this really is a good opportunity to have a look at the data quality and data cleansing features in Time Extender. The reason we've got this situation is if we have a look down here at the data as it came into Time Extender before it was had its rules applied in terms of integrity, we'll see a lot more data, and this is all the data that comes from AX. But the reason it doesn't end up in the valid table at the end of the data warehouse phase is that our salesperson ID is in almost all cases 0. There's only a few records that have got a salesperson assigned to them, and that's just a data quality issue. In AX, the salesperson hasn't been assigned to a lot of customer accounts in this particular set of demo data. So because as a DBA, as a database developer, Oliver doesn't know the answer to this problem and can't go and manually plug all these things in, what we can do for now to get the information back to Sarah is to just create a dummy salesperson, and this will exist in the metadata within Time Extender, and we can modify and change it later. So if we go back in here to our custom data, and we'll see here those records that we've still got in there from our template model, which we can pull out at some point, and create a record for 0, because that's what AX is storing in there as a blank value, and then we can just put a description in there. No salesperson in AX, and then if we deploy and execute that table now, just to populate that data into there, and we re-execute our fact table, when we browse our data now, in the valid table we've got all those records because we've got a real referential match to our salesperson ID. So from here we can go across to the cubes tab, and we've still got the same cube defined here. We're not going to do anything at all to the cube. We've still got our same set of measures and dimensions. All we're going to do is execute our cube to repopulate the data, which will take the data that's now in our data warehouse and populate it through into the cube. And then if we switch to Excel, we can pull up our pivot table again. So if we go to data and create a new connection to our SQL server, which is on my local machine, and find our sales cube and add that into Excel, we can then go and add in our values. So you see the numbers now much bigger because they've got our AX data in there, and we can have a look at customers by name, and we can go and have a look at the items that those customers purchased and the values associated with them. And if we were to put in our salesperson name, we'll see there that these are our names from our demo data, and then all of the other records coming from AX don't have a salesperson assigned, so they'll fall into that category of no salesperson in AX. So this information can go back to Sarah, and Sarah can either then go and populate them in AX so that the data is correct in the source system, and then if we re-execute the flows throughout the data warehouse project, they'll appear in the cube. Or we could write some routines into Time Extender to pull those from elsewhere, or to hard code those values in, and we'll look at those in the next video. Okay, so we've added our data into our extract, transform and load. We've published it through to the data warehouse, we've refreshed our cubes, and we can now go back to Sarah as the sales manager and say, this is the information, this is the data you asked for out of your AX 2012 system, populated into our model. We've obviously still got our sample data in there, but we can remove that quite easily, and we'll do that in the next video as we move on towards presenting this out to the user. So this is where we're at in our agile approach, in our agile model. We've done our ETL creation. We can now hand over our system with fully working data in an analysis services cube for user testing managed by Sarah, and then Sarah, with the help of Oliver from IT, can push that out to the users. And then we start the loop again, and we go back and obtain a user story, which might be an embellishment on the one we've just looked at, or it might be a brand new requirement altogether, and we start the loop again. So the next video we'll look at how to create dashboards in Excel, make this data look a little bit nicer for the end user, and how we might publish that out to end users across the business, and not just at a kind of high level management view using a pivot table.